The midday sun blazed relentlessly over the wide, open expanse of the desert training range, casting long shimmering heatwaves that danced across the dry, cracked ground. The air was heavy with the scent of sun-baked sand and faint traces of spent gunpowder from earlier drills. Distant pops of gunfire punctuated the steady hum of the wind, echoing off low, dusty hills that ringed the range. Soldiers in green fatigues moved about with practiced ease, some cleaning weapons on benches, others reloading magazines or adjusting their gear under the shade of the canopies. Near one of the firing lanes stood an intimidating piece of precision engineering, a massive sniper rifle, black and angular, resting on its bipod atop a wooden shooting table. Its long, heavy barrel gleamed faintly under the sun, and the oversized scope mounted on top looked like it could bring the moon into sharp focus. Beside it, an older sniper with tanned, weather-worn skin and a neatly trimmed mustache chatted casually with a couple of younger soldiers. His voice carried the easy confidence of someone who had spent years behind a trigger. Standing just a few steps away, looking slightly out of place in her simple jeans and fitted t-shirt, was a young woman. She wasn't military. No patches, no boots, no tactical gear, just an ordinary civilian visiting the range as part of an outreach event. Her long hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and the faintest squint creased her brow as she eyed the weapon in front of her. The sniper turned toward her, picking up the rifle as if it weighed nothing, though even seasoned shooters knew it was far from light. "Here," he said with a faint smirk, holding it out to her. "Go ahead, just hold it. See what it feels like." His tone was casual, but the soldiers lingering nearby exchanged amused glances. Most people who handled the rifle for the first time couldn't keep it steady for long. She stepped forward, gripping the weapon with both hands, surprised at the weight that instantly pulled at her arms. The cold, matte finish of the metal felt solid and unfamiliar under her palms. She shifted her stance, letting the rifle rest against her shoulder as she tilted her head slightly, glancing toward the scope but not yet peering through it. The men around her didn't expect her to do much more than admire it for a moment before setting it down. One soldier, a younger man with a buzz cut, gestured toward the farthest steel target on the range. It was so distant it was barely more than a pale speck against the dusty hills. "See that?" he asked with a grin. "That's 2,950 meters away. Almost 3 kilometers. Even the best of us don't hit it every time." The heat seemed to press down harder, the world around them shimmering as if in a mirage. She glanced in the direction he'd pointed, narrowing her eyes against the glare, as if trying to fix the tiny target in her mind. The wind picked up slightly, brushing strands of hair against her cheek. She adjusted her grip again, her arms tightening around the rifle, testing its balance. There was no sign of intimidation in her expression, only curiosity, and something else the soldiers couldn't quite name. The sniper who had handed her the weapon tilted his head slightly, noticing it too. No one in that small cluster imagined that this simple moment, a visitor, just holding a rifle, was about to change into something far more remarkable. But the shift had already begun, quietly, in the set of her jaw and the focus in her eyes. The desert, the sun, the heat, and the rifle were aligning into a scene they would never forget. The spotter crouched beside the prone shooting position, his elbows resting on the dry, dusty ground as he peered through a high-powered pair of binoculars. The sun reflected off the metal frames, and a faint shimmer of heat distorted the view far downrange. He adjusted the focus with slow, deliberate twists of his fingers until the distant steel target came into crisp clarity. It stood nearly 3 kilometers away, a white silhouette plate, motionless in the sweltering air, framed by the jagged line of the hills. "That's it," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of challenge. 2,950 meters. He glanced over at her, almost expecting her to laugh at the impossibility of it. Instead, she just studied the direction he pointed with a steady, unblinking gaze. Around them, a few soldiers leaned in, curious to see her reaction. Hitting a target from that distance wasn't just difficult, it bordered on the absurd for someone who had never fired a sniper rifle before. One man chuckled quietly and shook his head. "Even veterans miss that shot," he said under his breath. "Half the time it's just a waste of ammo." The remark wasn't meant to be cruel, but it carried the easy dismissal of someone certain of the outcome. To him, this was a harmless moment, a civilian getting a feel for the weapon, maybe firing at a much closer target for the novelty of it. But the young woman didn't seem interested in novelty. She took a knee, then eased herself into the prone position without hesitation, mirroring the posture of the shooters she had watched earlier. The heavy rifle settled into her shoulder with a dull thud, its bipod digging into the coarse sand. Her fingers brushed along the scope's adjustment knobs, almost experimentally, though she hadn't yet looked through it. "You're not seriously going to try?" one of the soldiers asked, his tone half amusement, half disbelief. Her eyes flicked toward him briefly, not in defiance but in a calm acknowledgement of the challenge. Then she leaned forward and finally peered through the scope. The world around her seemed to vanish, replaced by the narrow circle of glass and the distant blur of the hills. For a moment, the target was nothing more than a shimmering white ghost, distorted by the heat waves rising from the earth. The spotter shifted, moving closer to her side. "All right," he said, humoring her, "if you're going to line up a shot, you'll need some numbers." He glanced at his handheld weather meter and began rattling off data in a matter-of-fact tone. Wind speed, wind direction, temperature, humidity. It was the kind of information a seasoned sniper would need to calculate bullet drop and drift over such an incredible distance. She listened without interruption, making small adjustments to the scope. Her breathing slowed as she settled deeper into the position, elbows planted firmly into the sand. The rifle felt heavy but steady now, the weight working in her favor to anchor her against a slight breeze. From the sidelines, another soldier muttered to his friend, "She won't even hit the dirt near it." The friend just shrugged, keeping his eyes fixed on the scene. There was something oddly compelling about the way she moved, deliberate, measured, without the nervous fidgeting they usually saw in first-timers. The wind quieted for a moment, the kind of stillness that seemed to settle over the desert in brief, fleeting pauses. The spotter noticed it too and gave a small nod. "If you're gonna do it," he said, "now's the time." She didn't answer. Her hands were steady, her cheek pressed firmly against the stock, and her finger hovered near the trigger. The desert stretched before her in shimmering waves, the target a lonely speck in the heat. No one watching believed she would land the shot, but already, the quiet shift in the atmosphere suggested something unusual was about to happen. Through the polished glass of the sniper scope, the world became a narrow tunnel of focus. The crosshairs hovered over a distant blur, the white silhouette target nearly 3 kilometers away. The image wavered slightly, distorted by the rippling heat rising from the sand. Each mirage shimmer felt like a veil between her and the goal, making the shot seem even more impossible. She adjusted the scope slowly, her fingertips turning the dials with a careful precision, bringing the shape into sharper definition until it was just clear enough to aim at. Beside her, the spotter crouched low, one eye pressed to his binoculars. His voice was calm but quietly doubtful as he called out the final adjustments. "Wind's almost nothing. Elevation, you're gonna want 28.5 mils up." He hesitated before adding, "Even then, at this distance, it's luck as much as skill." His words weren't meant to discourage her, just to remind her of the reality. At nearly 3 kilometers, even expert marksmen accounted for bullet drop measured in stories and a flight time long enough to take a breath between trigger pull and impact. She barely reacted to his comment. Her breathing slowed, deep and measured, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm she had unconsciously copied from the shooters she'd watched earlier. One breath in, a slow exhale. She adjusted her position slightly, pressing the stock more firmly into her shoulder, feeling the snug, almost anchored connection to the weapon. The murmurs of the small crowd behind her faded from her awareness. Their amused chuckles, the soft crunch of boots shifting in the sand, the faint metallic clink of gear, all of it fell away until there was only the rifle, the crosshairs, and the target. The air felt heavier now, the silence between gusts of wind stretching longer. She studied the scene through the scope. The target stood alone, bathed in sunlight, its edges almost glowing in the haze. Around it, the desert was empty and still, not a single bird or insect breaking the stillness. The horizon shimmered faintly, as though the air itself was watching, holding its breath. The soldiers watching leaned in, their earlier laughter softening into a curious quiet. They had seen beginners take shots before, wild, shaky attempts that sent dust clouds spraying meters away from the target. But there was something about her composure that pulled their attention in. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't second-guessing. She was deliberate. The spotter gave one final reading. Wind 0.2 right. Hold 1 click left. His voice was low now, almost matching her own calm. He couldn't explain why, but he felt himself starting to root for her. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, not pulling yet, just feeling the smooth curve of it. Another slow inhale. Another careful exhale. In that narrow circle of the scope, the target seemed closer now, not in distance but in presence. She wasn't just aiming at it, she was connected to it, as though the gap between them no longer mattered. The sun pressed down hard, but the air was still. No dust swirled. No breeze stirred the dry bushes dotting the terrain. For one rare moment, the desert was utterly calm. She tightened her grip ever so slightly, her muscles steady and controlled. The rifle, heavy moments ago, now felt balanced and ready, an extension of her will. Her pulse slowed, and in that instant, she knew this was the moment to fire. The world narrowed to the crosshairs on the center of the target, and the quiet before the shot felt like a held breath shared by everyone watching, even if they didn't realize it. The shot broke the silence like a thunderclap, the deafening crack of the rifle rolling across the open desert and bouncing back from the distant hills. The recoil hit her shoulder hard, a sharp, solid punch that shoved her back into the earth, but she held her position without flinching. A faint cloud of dust rose around the rifle's muzzle, twisting away in the still air. The echo lingered for a long moment before fading into the steady hum of the heat. The spotter's binoculars jerked slightly as he tracked the bullet's invisible arc across nearly 3 kilometers of open space. At this distance, the projectile would take more than 4 seconds to reach the target, an eternity in shooting terms. The waiting was almost unbearable, the air thick with anticipation. No one spoke. Even the faint shuffling of boots and gear from the soldiers behind her had stopped entirely. She stayed in position, cheek pressed to the rifle's stock, eyes fixed through the scope as if she could watch the rounds journey through the haze. The seconds stretched. Somewhere out beyond the heat shimmer, the white silhouette stood motionless, its stillness taunting them with the likelihood of a miss. Then, a faint sound drifted back through the heavy air, not the sharp ring of a close hit, but a distant, metallic ping, soft yet unmistakable. The spotter froze, his breath catching mid-inhale. His binoculars locked onto the target, and for a heartbeat, he said nothing, as though his mind needed to confirm what his eyes were telling him. A small, dark mark had bloomed dead center on the steel plate. "No way," he muttered, barely above a whisper. The soldiers crowded behind her snapped their eyes to the spotter, searching his face for confirmation. When he lowered the binoculars just enough for them to see his stunned expression, a ripple of disbelief moved through the group. A couple of men immediately dropped to one knee, yanking up their own scopes to verify, as though they couldn't trust another person's word on a claim this outrageous. Through the magnified glass, the truth was undeniable. The mark was there, fresh, sharp, right in the middle of the target. It wasn't a lucky graze on the edge, nor a fluke strike on some random part of the plate. It was clean, centered, perfect. The sniper who had handed her the rifle just stood there, arms still crossed, his brow furrowed in disbelief. He'd seen extraordinary shots in his career, shots that defied odds, but this felt like something else entirely. He started to say, then stopped, shaking his head slightly, unable to finish the sentence. She slowly sat up from the prone position, her hands still resting lightly on the rifle as if she hadn't yet realized what she'd done. There was no wild celebration in her face, no loud exclamation of victory, only a small, calm flicker in her eyes, like someone quietly acknowledging they had met a challenge head-on and succeeded. One soldier finally broke the silence with a laugh, not mocking, but stunned and almost incredulous. 3 kilometers, first try, no way. Another clapped his friend on the shoulder, muttering something under his breath that no one caught, but it carried the unmistakable tone of awe. In the distance, the target remained as still as before, the mark in its center the only sign of what had just happened. The desert wind returned at last, sweeping through the range as if the world itself had been holding still for the moment. Those watching knew they had just witnessed something rare, something they might never see again, and for a long while, no one quite knew what to say. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint rustle of wind picking up over the desert floor, carrying with it the lingering scent of burnt gunpowder from the shot. Everyone on the range seemed frozen, still caught in the suspended disbelief of what they had just witnessed. Then, as if released from an invisible hold, the small crowd erupted into life. Voices overlapped in bursts of astonishment. Some laughed in disbelief, others swore under their breath, and a few simply shook their heads as though trying to clear away the impossibility of what they'd seen. One soldier stepped forward, hands on his hips, a broad grin spreading across his face. "You've got to be kidding me," he said loudly, half to her, half to everyone else. "Dead center, at 2,950 meters, on your first shot." His voice rose slightly at the end, teetering between admiration and incredulity. Another man crouched by the sniper rifle still resting on its bipod, studying it as though the weapon itself might hold the secret to the miracle shot. "This thing's sighted imperfectly," he muttered, "but that still doesn't explain." He trailed off, glancing up at her with narrowed eyes. "How did you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached forward and lifted the rifle with careful hands, the weight familiar now, almost comfortable. She stood, brushing dust from her jeans, and passed it back to the sniper who had given it to her in the first place. His large, calloused hands closed around the weapon slowly, as if accepting it back from someone who had just returned it in better shape than they'd received it. The man studied her face for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, searching for a clue, some sign that she'd been bluffing earlier, that this was all some elaborate setup. But her expression was unreadable, calm and faintly amused, as though the incredible shot was nothing more than a small, private victory. Behind them, a pair of soldiers peered through their scopes again, confirming for the third time that the hit was real. "Dead center," one confirmed in a low voice, shaking his head slowly. "You couldn't script that if you tried." A ripple of chatter moved through the group. Someone mentioned that even veteran snipers with years of combat and competition experience rarely hit such a long shot cleanly on the first try. Another muttered something about probability, how even with perfect calculations, the slightest shift in wind or heartbeat could throw the shot off by meters. And yet, she had done it, without hesitation, without warm-up, without years of training. The sniper slung the massive rifle over his shoulder and let out a slow, measured breath. "That's a world-class shot," he said finally, his tone quiet but heavy with respect. "I've seen men train half their lives and never pull that off." He wasn't smiling, exactly, but there was a glimmer of something like pride in his eyes, the rare acknowledgement from one professional to another, even if she didn't claim to be one. She gave a small shrug, the corners of her lips curving in the faintest smile. "Beginner's luck," she said, her voice even and almost playful. But no one around her believed that for a second. The group began to disperse slowly, but every few steps, someone would glance back at her, still shaking their head in disbelief. The sun was dipping slightly toward the horizon now, casting long shadows across the range, but the story of what had happened here was already spreading. Before the day was over, it would be retold a dozen times, and with each telling, the awe in their voices would grow. As she turned to leave, the desert wind swept past again, carrying with it the metallic tang of the distant target and the memory of a single, perfect shot.